Well, hello again. This is Alister McGrath speaking again about some of the great themes of Christian apologetics. And this lecture is all about narrative apologetics. Let me begin by giving you a quote from my Oxford colleague N.T. Wright, better known as Tom Wright, which I think could serve as a motto for, or even a summary of, the core themes of this lecture. Here's what he says. The whole point of Christianity is that it offers a story which is the story of the whole world. And in case you're wondering, this comes from his 1992 work, The New Testament and the People of God. Now, in the sixth lecture, I want to explore an area of Christian apologetics which has a lot of potential for development, and I think you'll enjoy this, and you'll enjoy particularly working out how you can take it and use it in your own distinct way. The term narrative apologetics is now widely used to refer to ways of explaining and commending the Christian faith through narratives, through stories. But this goes way beyond the traditional idea that we should tell stories to help make some apologetic points. Now, I know lots of preachers use stories in this way, and lots of people find this very helpful. But narrative apologetics is about more than just using stories apologetically. It's about realizing that the Christian gospel is itself about a story. The story of Jesus Christ, which intersects both with the story of Israel and the story of the human quest for meaning and significance today. And so this lecture is all about this approach. I'm going to explore it. I think you'll find it helpful. And I want to make the point that I'm not for one moment suggesting that narrative apologetics is the only or the best form of apologetics. I'm not saying that at all. It is a form that can supplement your other approaches. In other words, I want you to think very seriously about this being another resource at your disposal as an apologist. I'm going to tell you it works well, and there are lots of things you can do with it. So, apologetically, what I want you to do is to think of Christianity as out-narrating the dominant stories of our culture. In plain English, we tell a better story. That's the title of Josh Chatrall's recent book, and it's a very good book. Christianity Tells a Better Story. So let's look at C.S. Lewis as we begin to explore this point, because he makes this point, I think, rather well. In his 1941 sermon, The Weight of Glory, Lewis reflects on how the cultural dominance of a materialist meta-narrative might be broken. How could its spell be removed? And Lewis's answer is really interesting. To break a spell, you have to weave a better spell. Here's what he says. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness that has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. Now here's the point Lewis is making. To break the spell of one story, an imprisoning story, we need to tell a better story, a liberating story. Now, again, let me just repeat that a narrative approach to apologetics does not replace or displace other approaches. You might think, for example, of those based on reasoned argumentation, which you find in the writings of, William Lane Craig and Richard Swinburne. The point is that narrative apologetics enriches other approaches. It's one more arrow in your quiver. Yet it is an approach that a lot of people today will find particularly winsome and welcome. And my own experience has been that it appeals particularly to those who find rational approaches to apologetics a bit dull, lacking imaginative depth and emotional intelligence. And I think Marilyn Robinson is surely right when she suggests there's always, and I quote, an inadequacy in argument about ultimate things. So let me go back to that quote from Tom Wright, which I introduced right at the beginning of this lecture. The whole point of Christianity is that it offers a story which is the story of the whole world. Now, there's a parallel here with Christian writers like J.R.R. Tolkien, who emphasize that Christianity is, I quote, a story of a larger kind that makes sense of the story of our lives and the world. And the Christian Bible, as many have pointed out, consists mainly, but of course not exclusively, of narratives, of stories of individuals who are found by God, who've been transformed by God, and who seek to tell others about God. But there's a point here which I want to emphasize. Yes, we tell stories all the time. Why do we tell them? Why are we storytelling and meaning-seeking animals? If storytelling is a fundamental human instinct, then what story can be told to explain our propensity to tell stories? Now, as you might expect, Christianity is very good at explaining why we tell these stories. The intellectual foundations of narrative apologetics was laid down in the first half of the 20th century by three leading literary figures, all of whom had close connections with Oxford University: C.S. Lewis, Dorothy L. Sayers, and J.R.R. Tolkien. One of the central themes of Lewis's apologetics, which we've touched on already, is that Christianity offers us a narrative, a story, which is capable of generating a big picture of reality, which makes sense of our subjective experiences and our observations about the world around us. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Lewis doesn't try to prove the existence of God on a priori grounds. Here are arguments for God's existence. No, he rather invites us to appreciate how Christianity tells a story about reality, which both invites an imaginative embrace and also communicates a conceptual framework by which other things are to be seen. Do you remember that quote I gave you earlier about the sun illuminating a landscape? That is very much what Lewis is all about. The gospel makes sense of things. But for J.R.R. Tolkien, he takes things further, answering the question, why do we tell stories in the first place? For Tolkien, the human instinct to tell stories of meaning is actually grounded in a Christian doctrine of creation, which provides a theological basis for our capacity to create stories like, for example, the great fantasy epic of the Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien argues that because we have been created in the image of God, we possess an innate desire to tell and hear stories which unconsciously echo the greater story of God. Here's what he says: "We make in our measure and in our derivative mode, because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker." Now listen, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the theory of narrative apologetics. You can read all about this if you want to. What we want to know about in this lecture is really what we can do with this. How do we use this tool? And that's what I'm going to talk about now. Let's begin by thinking about how we might use biblical stories apologetically. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Bible is rich in stories, in narratives. Think, for example, of the stories of creation, fall, the calling of Israel, and the death and resurrection of Christ. These are all told in narrative form. And there's a sense in which to be a Christian is actually to see this grand story as defining and authoritative, calling into question, for example, rival stories of human origins, nature, and destiny offered by our secular culture. And for Christians, our own stories are given meaning and value by being interpreted by and located within this greater story. And apologists often emphasize the importance of grasping and inhabiting this grander story, because its comprehensiveness and its coherence are real apologetic virtues. Now, in this section, what I'm going to do is focus down on a number of individual biblical narratives and ask how we might use these apologetically. So think of them as case studies. They might give you ideas about how you might develop your own approaches. And obviously, I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm sure there'll be points where you feel you can do a lot better than I could. And actually, if you do, that's wonderful. These discussions, these case studies are really just discussion starters intended to give you some brain food so that you can improve on what I'm offering you. Let's turn to the first of these stories, which is the Exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt. Now, I'm sure you know the story of the Exodus very, very well, but let me just recapitulate and then make an apologetic application. The narrative of the Exodus is a very dramatic, a very well-known story that is well-known in our culture. You can easily retell it and use it apologetically. It tells about the people of Israel escaping from their captivity in Egypt and then going through an extended period of wandering in the wilderness before finally entering the Promised Land. And theologically, the story of the Exodus serves several very important roles. For example, it's a reminder of both the historical origins of Israel and the presence and power of Israel's God. In fact, as you probably know, at many points in the Old Testament, the God of Israel is identified as the one who delivered Israel from captivity in Egypt. Think, for example, of Deuteronomy 5:15, which I'll quote now. "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm." And the point here is that Israel's God stands at the heart of the story of redemption and deliverance. So that's the biblical story. Now, how can we make use of this apologetically? Now, I'm going to make some suggestions, but as I've emphasized, these are just starters. They're there to stimulate you, and I'm hoping you'll be able to take them further and do better than I can. Here's an obvious suggestion. This story describes the condition of humanity. For the New Testament, we are in bondage, trapped in a situation that's not of our own choosing and from which we cannot break free. Humanity, unredeemed humanity, are characters in a story which we did not write and cannot control. We are the slaves of, to quote Colossians 2:8, the elemental spirits of the universe, which we don't recognize being legitimate and which don't have our own interests at heart. And here's the point. We long for a liberation that seems to lie beyond our grasp. We long to become the people that we sense we are meant to be. Or, to put it another way, we are in Egypt, hoping for our own promised land. Where we are is not where we're meant to be. The way things are is not the way things are meant to be. We belong somewhere else, somewhere that lies beyond this. So, where is this land to be found, and who is going to deliver us? Now, obviously, the answer lies in a Christian reading of the Exodus narrative that leads into the good news of Christ as the new Moses, who liberates humanity from bondage and journeys with them as they prepare to cross the Jordan and enter into the new promised land. So if you like, it affirms both the human need for redemption in the first place, but also the existence of a Redeemer who's able to break the power of sin and lead us into the new Jerusalem. And above all, it invites us to step into this narrative of redemption and make it our own. So apologetics could be seen as an invitation to taste and see that the Lord is good, quote from Psalm 34, sampling the spiritual quality of the Christian rendering of reality and reflecting on what this implies in terms of its intellectual trustworthiness. I would like you now to think how you might tell of how you were in captivity, how you were cut off from what you would now recognize to be your true home, and how you were rescued and brought to safety. And clearly, a key theme is the hope of deliverance. We can be changed. So how would you use that apologetically? There's a lot there for you to discover and to use. So let's move on and look at a second biblical story and consider how we might use this second story apologetically. And we're going to move from the Exodus to the Exile. Now, the second biblical narrative I'm going to talk about is that of the exile of the people of Jerusalem in the great city of Babylon, probably the largest city in the world at the time. In the 6th century before Christ, Jerusalem was the small capital city of the sparsely populated kingdom of Judah, which found itself caught up in a real international power dynamic between Egypt and the Babylonian Empire. And the historical narrative of the exile culminates with a Babylonian assault on the cities of Judah, including Jerusalem, which resulted in the destruction of the Jerusalem temple and many other buildings, and for our purpose, most importantly, the deportation of several thousand of the population of Jerusalem to Babylon in 587 BC. Babylon was a long way from Jerusalem. Now, 50 years later, Babylon finally fell to Cyrus the Persian, and shortly afterwards, Cyrus issued a general decree permitting those who'd been deported to Babylon to return home. And most, not all, but most of the Jews chose to make that long return journey to Jerusalem. Now, I've given you a very brief account of that story. It's a story of being in exile away from your homeland and the hope of returning home. So how could we use that story apologetically? Well, again, let me make some suggestions which I hope you will take further. Many people today experience a sense that they don't really belong here. It's a very well-known experience, and it's arguably reflected in many movements in human culture, such as the rise of Gnosticism in late classical antiquity. And although Gnosticism isn't really a coherent philosophical or religious system, it did have a number of distinctive ideas, including a sense of alienation and disconnectedness from the world, a sort of deep intuition that this is not where we really belong. For Gnostic writers, we find ourselves trapped in this world. We are, like to use a very famous Gnostic phrase, we are gold in the mud. We belong somewhere else. But it's not just Gnostics who think like that. G.K. Chesterton also knew this sense of existential unease, and he expressed it rather pithily in one of his neatest aphorisms. Here it is, listen to this. We have come to the wrong star. That is what makes life at once so splendid and so strange. The true happiness is that we don't fit. We have come from somewhere else. We have lost our way. Now, how does that strike you as a description of the human dilemma? We have lost our way. We don't fit. And we find the same idea if you're interested in the German philosopher Martin Heidegger's idea of Geworfenheit, which literally means thrownness. It refers to the frustration we experience of being thrown into the world, being trapped and limited by constraints which are not of our own choosing. And that's a really important cultural motif, and you often find this echoed in popular culture. For example, think of the American rock band The Doors. In one of their songs, the lyrics include these words, "Into this world we're thrown." It's a good phrase, you can use that. The point is, we didn't choose to be born in this world, and we wonder whether we can find our way to somewhere and something that is better. So, with that point in mind, let's look at the narrative of the exile. And this story invites us to imagine ourselves as one of the people of Jerusalem living in Babylon, treasuring the memories of a lost Jerusalem and longing to return there. Think of Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. The people of Jerusalem had been thrown into Babylon. They didn't belong there. Their true identity lay in their lost homeland, to which they longed to return, but some thought they never would. Now, in our own case, we're invited to see Babylon not as the ancient city, but as an existential place into which we find ourselves thrown. It's not of our own choosing. And you may know F. Scott Fitzgerald's short story Babylon Revisited, written in 1931, which focuses on a cultural sense of dislocation and alienation. That is still around. And this whole idea of being in exile is a very powerful metaphor for engaging people who feel this sense of dislocation and alienation. The New Testament itself doesn't explicitly engage the exile theme, but of course it does have its counterparts. For example, think of the implicit appeal to the Roman concept of a colony in Paul's letter to Philippians. Think, for example, of Philippians 3:20. Our citizenship is in heaven, and it's from there we are expecting a Saviour, the Lord Jesus Christ. And the point here is that Philippi, who by the way was named after the father of Alexander the Great, was annexed by the Romans in 148 BC, and in New Testament times it was a Roman colony populated by Roman citizens and governed according to Roman law. And here's the really important point. Roman citizens residing in Philippi, like any other colony, had the right to return home to Rome after their service in Philippi. They might live in Philippi, they might work in Philippi, but they belonged in Rome. Philippi was not their true homeland. Now, for Christians, the story of the exile connects up with the sense of alienation and dislocation. It gives us an imaginative interpretative framework that allows us to see ourselves in exile in this world. Here's the point. It's not our true homeland. It's a place into which we have been thrown. We didn't choose to be here. We've been thrown here. And our quest is to find our way back to where we are meant to be. To use the language of Leviticus 25, we are strangers and sojourners. We're people who pass through this world, but we don't really belong there. So the Christian reading of the exile narrative thus begins a process of reflection, which helps us to see this world is not our true homeland. We have a sense of existential unease because we really belong somewhere else in heaven. And of course, this is a leading theme in the sermons and homilies of many early Christian writers. This sense of belonging in heaven, but being here, is put out in lots of ways by early Christian preachers. Think, for example, of Cyprian of Carthage's famous declaration in the 3rd century, "Paradise is our homeland." I've translated the Latin word patria by homeland. It's a deep word. That's where we really belong. But for the New Testament, the key theme really is that Christians are citizens of heaven, an image which implies the right to dwell in heaven, and that privilege is grounded in the work of Christ. As I'm sure you know, this hope is expressed, I think, particularly well in some lines from C.S. Lewis's novel, The Last Battle, which is the concluding volume of the Chronicles of Narnia. And you may know this passage because it's a very, very powerful passage. On seeing the new Narnia, Jewel the unicorn declared, "I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I've been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now." Can you help people to see there is a true homeland, create a longing for it, and then show them how it could be entered? That's your job. Let's move on to another story. Jesus Christ told stories, which of course we call parables. Now, I wonder how we might use parables apologetically. So let me give you a third case study and see what you think. Now, our third case study is one of the celebrated parables of the kingdom. And I know in popular literature we often think of these as earthly stories with heavenly meanings, but I think the parables are really better seen as expanded analogies, enabling their audiences to see things in a new way. They help us to grasp something that was otherwise elusive or make a connection that we've missed up to that point. If we're to live in the kingdom of God, we need to be able to visualize what this looks like and picture ourselves within it. And we look through the lens of the parables to see the new world that they anticipate and helping us to rethink our own world and what we are doing here. Now, obviously, there are lots of parables to think about. Now, I've chosen one. It's actually the parable of the pearl of great price, because I think this is very, very powerful. But listen, there are so many others you could choose. And again, this is a case study. There are lots of other parables to work with. Let me read this parable to you. It's Matthew 13, verses 45 and 46. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all he had and bought it. Now, in Greek, that's only 25 words long, and it sketches the outlines of a story. There's a sort of backstory there you're going to have to fill in. Do it imaginatively to add the detail and texture that your audiences might expect. but I found that the story has sufficient imaginative capacity to draw us into its world of meaning on its own. So let's just think about its potential. We might, for example, retell the story. Here's mine. You can do better than this. A merchant found a priceless pearl for sale and decides he ought to sell everything in order to possess it. Now, why would he do that? Well, because he'd found something that was not merely costly, but something that was supremely worth possessing, a thing of beauty. In its light, everything he already possessed seemed to be of little value. Sure, he owned pearls already, but they couldn't satisfy his longing. But this new pearl, the pearl of great price, could. And so the merchant began to realize that the pearls he already owned were simply a stage on his search for something of transcendent and permanent value. Yet they were good, but they made the merchant yearn for something even better, and something he knew he hadn't yet found. And then he came across that special pearl. And maybe there was a devastating moment of illumination when he realized that the pearls he already possessed didn't do the job. They weren't good enough. They were pointing towards something better, and he had to have that pearl of great price. Now, that's my retelling. You can do that better. But here's the question. What does that story mean? What response might it elicit from your audiences? For me, the parable engages the long human search for meaning and significance. It reminds us that many of the beliefs and values that we take hold of are like those lesser pearls. They once seemed worthwhile, and for a time they even offered fulfillment. And yet deep down, we knew there had to be something better. If you look at many personal narratives of coming to faith, like those of Augustine of Hippo or C.S. Lewis, you'll see that very often they include the themes of a sense of disillusion and inadequacy, which makes them receptive to the hope of a greater good or a bigger picture of reality, a better story, a more precious pearl, which up to that moment had eluded them. And that's a central theme in C.S. Lewis's first published work, The Pilgrim's Regress, published in 1933. And this work was written shortly after his conversion to Christianity, and it hints at many of the factors that brought Lewis to faith. Now, its central character is the pilgrim himself, John, who has visions of an island. And this island evokes a sense of intense yet transitory longing on his part. And at times, John is simply overwhelmed by this sense of yearning. He struggles to make sense of it. Where does it come from? What exactly is he yearning for? And in many ways, what Lewis is doing here is following through on Pascal's line of thought in answering this question. Is there an abyss, a depth within the human soul which is so deep that only God can fill it? And the point is that for Lewis, as for Pascal, all other explanations and proposed goals for the sense of deep yearning seem to fail to satisfy, both intellectually and existentially. So here's what Lewis says on this. Listen to this as I quote it from The Pilgrim's Regress. If a man diligently followed this desire, pursuing the false objects until their falsity appeared and then resolutely abandoning them, he must at last come into the clear knowledge that the human soul was made to enjoy some object that is never fully given, that cannot even be imagined as given in our present mode of subjective and spatio-temporal experience. Now, while Lewis's prose makes no explicit reference to the parable of the pearl of great price, the convergence of their conclusions can hardly be overlooked. There is something worth seeking, and until you find it, nothing is going to satisfy. Now, my very brief discussion of that parable will hopefully indicate to you the considerable apologetic potential of retelling the parables of the kingdom. And it's not surprising that so many apologists use these. Think of the parable of the prodigal son, with its central themes of alienation, disconnection, reconciliation, and homecoming, each of which could be the basis of an apologetic address in its own right. And you don't need to look very far to find retellings of this parable. I've already touched on the works of Marilyn Robinson, but think of Gilead, for example, or Home. These novels are best read in full for enjoyment and apologetic insight, and I can't really do justice to them here, but Robinson shows us how biblical narratives can be retold apologetically and leaves the door open for others to follow her example. So let's reflect on how we can apply these insights that we've been exploring in this lecture. One of the key themes is helping people to realize that there is a better story than the one that they know. So let's turn to a very well-known set of novels. I've talked about them already, but as an apologist, you will find you keep coming back to these. I'm talking about C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. They capture the imagination. They'll give you ideas, and really, they're a resource you need to master. C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia are really about discovering a better story, a bigger story that makes sense of all other stories, and then embracing it because of its power to give meaning and value to life. And I'm sure you know this, but at an early stage in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is the first of the Narnia novels, the four children begin to hear different stories about the true origins and destiny of Narnia. And they can't all be right. They're puzzled, so they find they have to make decisions about which persons and which stories they can trust. Is Narnia really the realm of the White Witch, or is she a usurper whose power will be broken when the two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve sit on the four thrones at Cair Paravel? Or is Narnia really the realm of the mysterious Aslan, whose return is expected at any moment? Now, as the children realize, they're hearing different stories. They can't all be right, and they need to figure out how these stories are to be tested. And here's the point. Gradually, one story emerges as supremely trustworthy, and that's the story of the noble lion Aslan. And as they begin to grasp this story, they realize that each individual story about Narnia turns out to be part of this greater narrative. And sure, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe hints at and only partially discloses this big picture, which is expanded in the remainder of the Narnia series. But the point is that this grand narrative of interlocking stories makes sense of the riddles of what the children see and experience around them. It allows the children to experience Narnia in a new way, to understand what they're experiencing. It's like a camera lens bringing the landscape of Narnia into sharp focus. So, as I prepare to bring this lecture to an end, let me make some suggestions about how you might develop the ideas I've been exploring with you. These are just suggestions. You don't have to do them, but I hope they will give you ideas about how you can take these ideas and do something interesting with them. First of all, and very important, I want you to appreciate the importance of your own story, because each of us has a story to tell. And one of the reasons why I love reading biographies, and I have to say sometimes writing them as well, is because it helps me to understand how Christianity changes people, how it becomes part of their lives. People aren't just containers filled with ideas, they are living realities whose existence is changed by the ideas that they embody and embrace. And those stories, your story, needs to be told. And there's ample biblical precedent for telling our stories as a way of demonstrating the ability of the gospel to change lives. And that's important because it shows us that it is life-changing, not simply reasonable or evidence-based. I mean, you might think of how Paul responded to criticism he faced in Jerusalem. This is in Acts 22. And he met that criticism by telling his story of a life-changing encounter with the risen Christ, which motivated his ministry and undergirded his proclamation of the gospel. And what Paul is saying there is that something happened to him which redirected the course of his life and the shape of his beliefs. And the key point here, I think, is that something, this radical new change, has to be set out in the form of a narrative. So there's one suggestion that you can begin to think about. The key point here is that in retelling our own stories, we bear witness to the capacity of the gospel to give us direction in life, to cope with uncertainty and difficulty, and actually to live well and meaningfully in what so often seems to be a confusing world. Now you make a point here. Telling stories about yourself is not being self-centered or self-serving. It's using yourself as an instrument, a window through which the gospel can be seen. And I want to stress that the personal narratives of individual Christians, yours and others, have enormous apologetic potential. They don't depend upon verbal brilliance for their appeal, but on the fact that they are real life accounts of truthful and faithful living. And as far as I'm concerned, a personal narrative could serve as a testimony to the capacity of the gospel to change lives, to give stability and purpose. And you know, there are a lot of people who are looking for those things. You can tell how you or others found them. And a personal narrative has the added advantage of inner authenticity and rhetorical power. It vastly exceeds the appeal of a logical argument, even though you can link these together in a creative and persuasive whole. That's one point I want to make. Here's a second point, which again may strike you as very obvious, but it's also very important. I want you to appreciate how important stories can be in explaining core ideas of faith. Let's think about one of these, the idea of the love of God. Now, a narrative approach to apologetics will tell us that it's disclosed in the story of Christ, laying down his life so that those who he loves might live. So you see, we're not appealing primarily to an abstract, timeless truth. God is love. We are retelling the story of Christ's death, inviting our audience to enter into that narrative and try to understand what is going on and how this might connect up with them. And here's a point which I'm sure you've thought of, but it is worth mentioning. You can enrich and give added depth to this narrative by using artistic images of the crucifixion. Now, a lot of people will find these helpful in focusing on the event of Christ's death and its significance. And of course, there are other literary narratives you can appeal to, but I think none of them ever displace or replace the gospel narratives of Christ's death. And using these images or telling that story will capture the imagination, creating a gateway for reflection on the significance of New Testament narratives about Christ. So that's something you can do. But there's another Christian idea that many people find difficult to explain to audiences, and that's the idea of sin. I think one of the things that people very often find difficult to explain is the capacity of sin to overwhelm and enslave us. And the difficulty very often is visualizing this. How can we help people to see the impact sin has upon us by distorting us, damaging us, and trapping us? And the real problem is that sin is very often seen as an abstract idea, and people find it difficult to grasp that. So we need to find a way of grasping the reality and significance of sin through becoming imaginatively receptive towards it. As you might expect, one of the best ways of doing this is through narratives. These engage our imaginations, and once having caught us, so to speak, we can begin to reflect on their intellectual substance. So, what narrative might we tell to help us convey the image of sin as a force which entraps us and from whose power we can't escape? How can we become imaginatively receptive to this kind of idea? Well, I mentioned the Chronicles of Narnia a few moments ago. Let's look at the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And in this very well-known book, C.S. Lewis tells of the undragoning of one of his more unpleasant creations, Eustace Clarence Stubb. Now, Lewis clearly doesn't like Scrub very much. He portrays him very unsympathetically as greedy and self-centered, and his objectives are really dominated by greed and self-advancement. And Scrub sees himself in terms of a narrative in which the possession of riches and treasure leads to him becoming a master of his destiny and his world. And then the story goes wrong. It's false. It can't be relied on. He realizes he's been mastered by his desires, which he finds he cannot control. He's trapped. And Lewis makes this point very, very clearly and very, very imaginatively. And in a beautifully described moment, Lewis describes Eustace Scrub changing into a dragon as a result of his greedy, dragonish thoughts. And the point here is that Eustace has become trapped within his own imagined and self-serving story, and he realizes he cannot break free from it. So he just feels, well, maybe I'm just wearing a dragon costume, I can get rid of this. But he can't. He cannot tear off the dragon's skin. Every time he tries to do this, he simply finds there are yet more scales beneath the surface. This goes deep. It's not superficial. Sin is not a garment which enfolds us that somebody can take off. It's part of our being. And we need help if anything's going to be done. Otherwise, the situation is hopeless and helpless. And then, of course, the story takes a dramatic and an unexpected turn. A lion appears and tears away at Eustace's dragon flesh with his claws. And of course we know this is Aslan, Eustace doesn't. And the lion's claws cut deeply. It's painful. And when all the dragon's scales are finally removed, the lion throws Eustace into a well from which he emerges purified, renewed, and restored. And of course, the immersion in the water of the well picks up on New Testament's language about baptism as dying to self and rising to Christ. In effect, it's all about being able to break free from this narrative of oppression and captivity and becoming part of a different narrative, a narrative of liberation. So Lewis there, I think, really helps us. He helps us to see how Eustace has been trapped by forces over which he has no control, and tells a story which makes that point, which captures our imagination, and gets across the point that Eustace wanted to master other people and ended up being mastered by sin. And the dragon's a symbol not really of sin itself, but rather of the power of sin to entrap, to captivate, and imprison. There's only one who can break its power, and that's Aslan, the one who heals and renews Eustace and restores him to what he was intended to be. It's a very powerful story. It can be developed in multiple directions. For example, Eustace finally realizes he becomes trapped in the web of falsehood and self-defeat, and he realizes he becomes so deeply enmeshed in this self-centered story, he can't break free from it. You can make the point. People get trapped in their own stories of mastering the world, of becoming rich and powerful, and then discover that actually that story has mastered them. They need a better story. They need a liberating story, and that's something that we are able to offer. Now, Lewis's narrative about Eustace Scrub serves a double function. First of all, it represents a narrative rendering of the Christian themes of sin and salvation, which vividly and realistically depicts sin as an enslaving force that cannot be overcome by human agency. Only God's grace can break the power of sin and liberate it from a spell. But it also invites us to reflect on what stories we might tell to make those same points in an imaginatively compelling and engaging way. So there, I think, is something for you to think about and develop further. There's a lot you can do. Now, in this lecture, I've been exploring how we can use stories to communicate and commend the gospel. But my use of Lewis's novel, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, raises a really interesting question, which we're going to look at in the next lecture. How can we use fiction to tell the truth? Surely there's a contradiction there. Well, I look forward to talking to you again very soon when we'll explore this fascinating question. Thank you so much for listening.